and welcome to Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. As Catherine said, I'm Audrey Chapuis, the director of the American Library in Paris. And I believe a few hundred of you are joining us live tonight to hear Amor Towles and Mark Mayer, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here with us. The American Library in Paris celebrates its 100th anniversary during this very strange year, and the book-loving community around the world has really rallied around our institution. So I wanted to thank you for supporting us in all the ways that you do. Big thanks to Grow at Annenberg for underwriting the speaker series, and to all of our donors and members for enabling the library to lend books, provide programs for all ages, and really be a cross-cultural center for readers from all over the world for over 100 years now. And to celebrate, I'd like to invite all of you to come to the American Library in Paris Book Awards ceremony. This is, of course, a virtual celebration, and it will happen January 14th. My colleague Gabby will be sharing a link for how to register for that event. It's free. You can join us from anywhere in the world. And the book award is a way to honor outstanding books about France or the French written in English. So I hope that you can all join us for that. And I wish you a very splendid holiday season with lots of reading time. So back over to my colleague, Catherine Oline.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Yes, so I'm delighted to be introducing Amor Towles and Mark Mayer tonight. First of all, I'll start with Amor and then read Mark's bio and hand it over to Mark to lead the conversation. So, born and raised in the Boston area, Amor Towles received his BA from Yale College and an MA in English from Stanford University. His first novel, Rules of Civility, published in 2011, was a New York Times bestseller and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of 2011. His second novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, published in 2016, was on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year while in hardcover. It was named one of the best books of 2016 by the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. Both novels have sold over 1 million copies. Mark Mayer has an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and a PhD from the University of Denver. His first book, Aerialists, won the Mishner Copernicus Prize and was shortlisted for the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing. He has been published in American Short Fiction, the Kenyon Review, Guernica, the Iowa Review, Best American Mystery Stories, and the New York Times, as well as interviewed in the Paris Review and BOM. He is assistant professor of creative writing in the University of Memphis, MFA. I'm delighted to have you both here, and without further ado, over to Mark Mayer to lead the interview. Thank you both.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much, and thank you to the library for hosting us, and to all of you for tuning in. And above all, thanks to you, Amor, for this remarkable novel. Like any novel worthy of rereading, A Gentleman in Moscow means something different every time it re-enters one's life. And I have to say, I found this to be really the perfect lockdown read. Because your protagonist endures a 32-year lockdown and not only survives it, but comes to consider himself the luckiest man in all of Russia. So I thought we could start with that, with confinement. And I wonder how your perspective on the Count's confinement and his project of figuring out how to make life meaningful inside of his confinement has changed in the last year that we've all been confined.
Sure thing, Mark. And I guess before I answer, let me start by thanking the American Library in Paris for hosting this event, for having me. I'm sorry we're not in person, although we'll do that at some point. Thanks to both Audrey and Catherine and Mark. Really, thank you for entering into a conversation with me. Before sort of talking about quarantine and COVID, maybe it makes sense to start with how I think about how I thought about confinement before all that, before the virus made its way across the globe. When I set out to write this book, sort of the notion for it really came out of the very simple thing that I was returning to a hotel in Geneva for the 8th year in a row as a part of my professional life, my prior professional life. when I was in the investment business. And when I walked into the hotel, I recognized some people in the lobby from the year before when I had visited the hotel last. And I thought to myself, oh, this is a nice hotel, but can you imagine if you actually had to live in it? And in the elevator on the way upstairs, I thought, actually, that's kind of an interesting idea for a book. A guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. And in my hotel room, I took out the hotel stationery and I began sketching the outline for the story. And right off the bat, I was like, well, if I'm going to take my protagonist and trap him in a hotel for 30 years, then he probably should be there not by preference, but by force. And that made me think of Russia. Made that little imaginative leap there, and very quickly I sort of had the vision of this idea of a count born at the end of the 19th century, sentenced to house arrest, and tracking his experience across the Stalinist era. So right off the bat, I having had that, some people said to me, well, were you anxious about taking a story and setting it in a single building? And to be honest, I wasn't anxious about that at all. There was a great attraction for me in the challenge of creating a story in which 95% of the activity occurs in a single space. And I knew that in taking on that challenge, I ran the risk that I was going to drive myself crazy, that it takes me about 4 or 5 years to write a book and to edit it fully. And so I knew I could drive myself crazy. I knew I could drive my reader crazy. But there are certain advantages that come with constraining the physical space of your narrative. And for me, the great example in American literature is Moby Dick, which we don't think of it always as that, but in Moby Dick, within 100 pages, Ismail gets on the Pequod, and he doesn't get off again until the book is over, almost 1,000 pages later. And by taking on that challenge, Melville is forced to bring the world to the boat. And he does so through all kinds of ingenious methods, whether it's through the analysis of the stars, through the history of the mythology of the ocean, through the economy of whales, through international trade, through the nations that are represented by the men who work on the vessel itself, never mind the obsession of Ahab and his whale. So that's what Melville is, bringing the world to the boat, and that's one of the reasons why that book is just so fabulous. So for me, starting a novel where there was a very strict set of confinement was a welcome challenge, because I knew it was going to be the same kind of challenge. I was going to have to bring the world to the hotel. Now, one of the things I generally don't do as a novelist is I really am not very interested in writing to my times. I think there are some great writers who write to their times, and certainly the great nonfiction writers generally are doing that. They're writing essays about what are the problems that we have in our society today, in the evolution of our arts or of our interrelationships or politics. But as a novelist, I'm wary about writing to my times. I'd rather build a story from the inside out that was kind of a cohesive, organic universe, and allow the interaction of the characters within that environment create something that we as readers can engage in, hopefully be entertained by, influenced by, moved by, informed by, but within the world that's been created. And in a way that sort of the idea of creating the hotel serves that purpose. And the fact that it was in another time in another country for me as American was a welcome factor. Now, when you do that, you say, well, I'm not interested in writing a book that's timely. You're crossing your fingers that you can create a work of art that, despite not being written to its times, will somehow become timeless, through the interplay of the characters, the expression of their sentiments and their ideas, through the poetry of the language. And that over the years, different readers with different backgrounds, different genders, different social classes, different races and religions can come to that narrative, get lost in it for a minute, and discover things that are meaningful to them and be timely for them. That's kind of what you're really hoping for. And occasionally, maybe the book will really become timeless in the more practical sense. So that sort of one of the ironies here is that I really set out to write a book that was not timely. And a few years later, we ended up with a a virus that has locked down many of us into small environments, and the book became timely, certainly in a way that I never anticipated. But it's been nice to have readers reach out and talk about how the book has helped them navigate the inconvenience and the emotional stress of being confined in their own homes.
I love what you say about sort of the constraints of the hotel as a kind of creative constraint that can activate your imagination. And I think the Pequot is such a great example of that. And I think it does, the Moby Dick achieved something timeless by bringing everything onto that boat, even though there's nothing to look at but water and horizon, and the occasional spout of a whale. And I think that this is a novel too that tries to bring everything into the space of the metropole. You achieve something similar by bringing in friendship, romance, family, fatherhood, adventure, all into the hotel. Once you had taken that elevator ride up and gotten out the stationery and sort of understood the premise of the novel, was that how you approached the work of plotting it? Like, I've got this guy and he's going to live his whole life in the hotel. Now, how much life can I fit into that existence that's conscribed in this way?
It's an interesting question. I'd like to kind of answer it in two stages. The first stage is that for anything I'm writing, whether it was Rules of Civility, which is my first novel, which was set in New York in 1938, a very different story than Gentleman in Moscow, or for Gentleman in Moscow, or I handed in my new novel to my editors in New York this morning.
Hey,
thank you. In the case of any of these three works, I start with a very simple premise, like man trapped in hotel for a long period of time. And if that really grabs me, the premise, and for some mysterious reason, generally in a very short period of time, I can kind of see the architecture of the story. In the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, I had sketched out on about 5 pieces of paper the key characters and events in the first 3 days after having the idea. I mean, it all happened in sort of over the course of a weekend. Now, I then spent some time later, some years later, when I decided to actually write the novel, I took that scaffolding and I spent a year building out a very detailed outline where all the various finer elements are beginning to be invented sort of almost chapter by chapter before I start writing the book. And that's been true for each of both Rules of Civility and my new novel. Simple premise, very rapid fire invention of kind of the key characters and details, and then a long investigation into what that story might be and how it might be told and what details might be present, all before I get to sitting down and writing chapter 1. So that's kind of the process. But in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, and you kind of imply this, I think, shrewdly in your question mark, in the case of that, each story is going to have its own tone, its own rules, as it were, based on the character and the setting and the story, which must be told that I have to tell on their behalf. It means all the elements of storytelling could change when I make the shift to a new tale. And when I shifted to A Gentleman in Moscow, there's a great tradition in American writing of minimalism. People like Hemingway, of course, or Raymond Carver, more in my lifetime. We see minimalism, obviously in French writing, in Russian writing, and someone like Chekhov. When I started Gentleman in Moscow, I knew it was not going to be minimalism. I self-consciously knew it was going to be maximalism. So as you say, not only was it going to expand time and involve multiple kinds of relationships, but I also knew it was going to have paintings and philosophy and history and literature and food and music. All of this stuff would be coming into the hotel. And then partly that's because of what we already talked about, is this notion of bringing the world into the confines of the hotel. But really, more importantly, it's because it was seen to me to be the natural expression of the Count's personality. As someone who was raised as an aristocrat, with the privilege of dedicating his life to the finer things as a young man, he has not had a job. He has not been married. What he has had is a thoughtful introduction to the arts, to fine living. And so, the world of food, wine, music, literature, philosophy are, his realm as it were. And so it's quite natural when he's in prison that he's going to bring all that with him, both as a comfort and, as a way to pass the time, as something to explore. And so that's kind of the way I ended up. As I was sketching out the outline in greater detail, anytime it would pop into my head and say, oh, maybe the Nutcracker should play a role in this story, I'd be like, why not? And then, oh, yeah, how about Casablanca? Yes, let's bring it in, and just keep sweeping in the various elements and trying to gauge, is there a natural place for them in this story? And if there isn't, you got to push it back out again. But when they kind of land and they start to kind of put on their own roots and you can see them kind of growing quickly within the landscape of the story, then you kind of go with it.
Well, I think that's one thing that really distinguishes your voice as a novelist, is this mode of appreciation. It's not just the breadth of the Count's compass, but there's a sort of generosity or a sense of an ode being written to each of these details as they enter into the consciousness of the novel. There's sort of an ode to bouillabaisse and to bread and to salts, and there's the reverence, which I suspect is yours as well as your characters, for Tolstoy and Chekhov and Tchaikovsky and Humphrey Bogart. I think, for me, it's part of what makes the novel feel so humane, is the generosity and the genuineness of the affection for these things, which is an appreciation of them, but it's also revealing something about the Count's own mind and the way that his heart works. So I'm curious about that. How does this mode of appreciation, if you see it that way, drive your imagination, or how does it feature in your own life?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way of putting it. I hadn't really exactly thought of that, but I think you're right. If I think back on the writing that I've admired, that has influenced me, like if I think of somebody like Thoreau, where Thoreau's Walden was probably the most influential book that I read as a young man, at the age of 18. And I had decided that I had fallen in love with writing and reading at the same time when I was in first grade. And I had been writing fiction since that time, and I always knew I wanted to write fiction. When I read Thoreau's Walden, what really struck me and what really affected me by that book was how he could delve into the simplest thing, and it just kept opening up in front of him, in front of us, so. And of course that's part of, again, it's a work of confinement too, right? He's going into the woods. He's going to live simply in a cabin with no furniture, or very limited furniture, very few visitors, sort of just a very simple landscape outside. But then he investigates that landscape very closely, whether it's the way ice forms on the lake, and how does ice form, and what does it look like, and how does that affect the animal life, and how has ice been used across time? And, he just sort of keeps going deeper and deeper and deeper into what it means, both in specific sort of scientific terms and historical terms, but also in metaphorical terms, as he lets his mind kind of look at the surface of the lake and think about the reflection of the stars on the surface of the lake, and what, and the lives of sailors, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as I say, when I first read Walden, I couldn't believe it. I don't think I'd ever read anything like it, where you had this, I think of it as radiance, that he would start with one little observation, and sort of radiance would start shooting off in all kinds of directions. And I just would have to keep stopping my reading after a few sentences just to take it in, to appreciate it, and all done in a way which is written with great cadence too, great poetic cadence. And so I think as a reader, as I've evolved, I've discovered that many of the great novelists will do that, and whether it's Tolstoy, Flaubert too, and Madame Bovary, you'll see these kinds of sort of minor investigations into something which is very everyday on the surface, and sort of right there in the living room, as it were, and suddenly we go deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and I think, like you said, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it's ode-like. Even when the narrator or the author doesn't like what he or she is looking at, it's ode-like, in that I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to push everything back, and I'm going to think about this moment, this thing, this sentence, this something that's been said, this memory that's been had, and give it its due, And I think so, even when it's a terrible thing, there's an aspect of awe and celebration that you bring to that. And so, yeah, I think that is a part of my work for some weird reason.
There seems to be a love in particular, actually, of the kind of catalog, which is something that, I think of Melville as another author who kind of works in this mode of appreciation, and he has his extracts at the start of Moby Dick. And Mishka has his Bread and Salt project here, which is a kind of catalog of, appreciating literature and also appreciating bread and Russian culture. And there's Zoot, the game that the Count and Sophia play, where they sort of catalog as many items as they can put in a certain category. And so that seems to be, there's the radiant kind of geometry that you described in Walden, but there's also, I think, an affection for cataloging these sort of lists that recur throughout the novel.
You're right, and I think I'm at another version, right? Because I think the list is the most pure form, and is a great modernist tool in many ways, and sort of crops up in some of the great novels of the 20th century in some weird ways, to sort of surface. And but for me, an aspect I've always had a great love of the art of Joseph Cornell, the American, quasi-surrealist, but who made boxes inside, these little elements and items, inside a little universe of a box. And I think of, I was very influenced sort of in a way by the notion of the Cabinet of Curiosities, and which you see evidence of in Paris and in London and in New York. The Cabinet of Curiosities were really the precursors to the great museums in these three capitals, the precursor to the museums of natural history, or to the art museums, the cultural museums, were these Cabinet of Curiosities, these rooms that the wealthy and privileged individual in the sort of post-Enlightenment era would fill with shelves and cabinets and have stuffed birds and the skulls of animals and the busts of famous poets and insect specimens and pieces of different kinds of stone, and gemstones, and in other words, it's sort of scattered across all these shelves and cabinets. And you would walk in, and it was sort of like, this is a comprehensive collection of what we know to be the world. It's kind of the idea. A globe in the middle of the room, and a desk at the other end, and that was the whole. The mind was kind of everything that could fit in this room, and the person sitting at the desk thinking about these various things. And the museum kind of grew out of that at the end of in the 19th century into the early 20th century, and I love, and in a way, John Mosco's a version of a Cabinet of Curiosity too, a very personal one, and so which is kind of the list or the encyclopedia, blown big.
I love that. And I mean, part of what I love about that is the way that it combines the total chaos of the Cabinet of Curiosity and a system of organization, right? It's being cataloged, it's being presented. And I want to return, you mentioned before, you have an extensive outlining process, a planning process. An outline suggests, it suggests linearity, an action and a repercussion. But the novel, it has that, but it also has this Cabinet of Curiosity kind of feel that you described. I mean, I think it feels like something that grows maybe more like a snowflake or a fractal. And I'm curious to hear more about your planning process and, how this kind of crystal grows over time, right? Because my sense is that your planning process works so well in part because of how it makes room for the chaos of your imagination. So yeah, I'd just love to hear you describe a little bit more, maybe in time lapse, how does a book kind of come together?
Right. So if you go back to that sort of notion, I build the scaffold of the idea, over a period of days, but then I dwell on it, and I think of it as designing. That's what I design the book for at least a year. And in the course of that design, I'm slowly building out an outline, kind of in your snowflake sort of version and metaphor is the right one, which is that I'm kind of figuring out, okay, these are the chapters, but then within each chapter, I'm beginning to get a sense of, okay, where does it take place? Who's in the room? what's being discussed? What are they doing? You know, and just over time as I'm walking, as I used to be while I was walking to work, while I'm driving, while I'm running on the treadmill, you know, I will sort of enter one of these chapters, these spaces, and sort of just start to visualize it, to try to understand it. Now, you kind of encourage, as an artist, you don't want to be in control of that whole process. You do want it to be a little dreamlike, you know, is that so when something sort of presents itself, you kind of go with that, you know, say, oh, you know, like in A Gentleman in Moscow, you know, what would be an example? You know, I love the scene of where they make the bouillabaisse. And I kind of had this, you start with like an esoteric notion. Okay, they're gonna gather together all the various materials in a time of scarcity to make a special dish. And as soon as I have that idea, I'm like, oh yeah, this is great, because on the one hand, it's the battle against the Soviet scarcity, but he's a waiter and he's friends with the chef, and so it's quite natural for them to use food as kind of a thing to build it around. It's an expression of the relationship. It's their memories outside of the times and outside of the geography that would be tied to this food. So all these sort of things kind of start to present themselves. And I started to say, okay, what time of day it's going to be, and what's the food, what's the dish? And then I'm like, oh yeah, bouillabaisse is perfect because it has all these various elements, some of which are hard to obtain. And then, as I say, you kind of get these moments where like, oh, because not all bouillabaisses are made this way. And I apologize to those of you in the south of France who object to this, but one of the recipes that I have made over time is a bouillabaisse that does involve orange zest, and that does involve a little Pernod, or absinthe, a dash of that as well. And so I was like, oh yeah, great. So they're gonna have to get an orange. They're gonna have to get absinthe, and that means you get to go to the bar, but then when the oranges come up, then you're like, oh, as you say, you're on the treadmill or whatever, you're walking, and suddenly I had this vision of, the Andre with his magic hands is going to come stumbling into the kitchen with an armful of oranges, and they're going to get out of control. How can you control an armful of oranges? And they're going to go shooting off, and I'm like, like a prison break. That's what it's like. It's like a prison break. And so, like I say, you let your kind of mind follow this through, but you're capturing that in notes, right? Just sort of notes to yourself. Once this whole thing is designed, then you sit down and you start to battle it out, sentence by sentence. And I think that counterintuitively for many, the whole reason that I spend so much time writing such a detailed outline with all the chapters, all the events, all the characters, etc., is because that frees me up when I'm sitting down to write a chapter to not be worrying about where's the bigger story going. That's all designed. I know who the people are. I know what's going to happen next. I know what room it's going to happen in. I don't have to worry about that. What I can do instead is, now that I know I'm in this chapter, in this room with these people, is I can kind of let the subconscious take over and the poetry of the language take over, and let the surprises happen. All these things, because I'm not managing. I don't have to manage and be worried about all the details in the bigger structure. That's all laid out in the outline. So I use the structure of the outline really to free up the poetic side when I'm sitting down to write the chapter itself. And that does mean when something weird presents itself, like the image of the oranges, it's like, oh yes, that's a bit of life that's going to pop up inside this cold steel outline, the thing that's going to pop up, and whether it's got a touch of humor to it, or a surprise. It's a surprising visually, or some physical action, all kind of tied into it. You're like, yeah, that belongs here, even though it's not a part of the plan per se.
It seems to me too that the cold steel outline allows you to have causes set off sort of chains of events that are smaller than might occur to someone who's plotting out a novel that's set over these 32 years in Russian history. There's something of the Rube Goldberg device about the novel, because the Count sort of defends his right to get his Tuesday trim. In an early chapter, a stranger snips off his mustache. And this leads to him meeting Nina and everything that comes after that. And, in some ways, all narrative works this way, but there's a lightness of touch, I think, to this project that's especially Rube Goldberg-y. the causes here are like the Bolshevik tribunals, but also mustaches.
Right.
And it made me think of a line I wanted to read. Towards the end of the novel, you write, Alexander Rostov was neither scientist nor sage, but at the age of 64, he was wise enough to know that life does not proceed by leaps and bounds, it unfolds. At any given moment, it is the manifestation of 1,000 transitions. Our faculties wax and wane, our experiences accumulate, our opinions evolve, if not glacially, then at least gradually, such that the events of an average day are as likely to transform who we are as a pinch of pepper is to transform a stew. And yet, here's a man who knows very well how much a pinch of pepper can sometimes transform a stew. And we've heard earlier in the novel about his sort of meteorological theory of life, in which a pinch of weather can sort of transform a life. So as a novelist, and an outliner, you have to determine what are the forces that are going to affect a life. On the one hand, you have historical inevitability, right? You have history, and on the other, you have mustaches. So, how do you navigate that? What are your thoughts there?
Your description of it is right on, which is that it's the play between the two, and so then it becomes, not to go back to the cooking metaphor, but yes, you have these, you're going to have philosophical passages. You're going to have passage of celebrating an emotional state or of a physical sensation. You're going to have, a crisis. You're going to have a bit of humor, and you're going to have the small details and the big details. All these things are going to be there, and so then it really becomes a game of feeling the balance between these things. And I think very much about the novel for me as being most similar in the arts to the composition of a symphony, in that, it's going to have movements. It's going to have different instruments that express themselves at different times. There's going to be motifs which are picked up and recur, potentially played in a different way by different instruments, but yet, obviously reminiscent of when the motif was played earlier in the symphony. And, there'll be moments of great elation where all the music is building to crescendo, and there'll be very soft, you have to kind of lean forward and listen to the soloist, playing very lightly. This is just what a novel is. And so like in the composition of a symphony, you have to kind of almost hear and sort of see the bigger picture. How are we moving through these various elements? And so a lot of that, I think, goes to, you have to trust your instincts, your artistic instincts at a certain point, and then a lot of it comes in the editing process, where you're kind of reading through it and you're like, we're too much into this type of storytelling. We need a moment of relief, and and I'm going to cut out half of this scene to get me faster to this little moment of levity, that somehow is just as important as this 7-page, carefully worded investigation of something heavy. That these two things are equally important. And so you're in the editing process. I try to be aware of that sort of balance of all those various components, and using the editing process to pull out parts that are throwing off the balance, as it were, so that the composition sounds right.
So the novel spans 32 years, but it doesn't do it at an even clip. You've engineered this really, I think, ingenious and a little bit zany timeline. And I'd love to hear you describe how it works and why you chose to adopt it.
Yeah, so for those of you listening, and by the way, thanks for coming, all of you. But thanks for reading the book. If for those of you who didn't notice this, that's terrific. There's no reason you should notice this. But the book has a very unusual structure, in that what it tells you is starts with the Count going through the doors of the hotel on day one, sentenced to house arrest. The book then tells you what happens 1 day later, 2 days later, 5 days later, 10 days later, 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, 3 months later, 6 months later, 1 year later to the day. And then it tells you what happens 2 years later to the day, 4 years later, 8 years later, 16 years later to the day after he arrived. And then it reverses itself. And from that midpoint in 1938, you go 8 years, 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, 6 months, 3 months, 6 weeks, 3 weeks, 10 days, 5 days, 2 days to the very exciting conclusion. So, that's the way the book is told, is those specific sort of accordion of days. And I had this notion when I was younger of telling a story that did something like this, some sort of mathematical pattern of sort of growing and shrinking, and I just hadn't used it. And literally the first hour that I came up, I was thinking about telling the story of John Moscow. I was like, oh, you know what? This is the perfect story to use that weird doubling cycle concept. And on my very first page of notes, I show the years, being broken down in that leaping form. And so let me say two things about that. The first is that, why would I do this? And the first is that it's what we call, or you can call artistically, as a generative device. There was a group of French writers, largely French writers. Some of them were still around. That was known as Oulipo. I don't know, for those of you who've never heard of it, which I don't speak French, I apologize, but that's short for works of potential literature, oeuvre de literature potentielle, or however you pronounce it in French. And Oulipo included Raymond Queneau and Georges Perec, the American Harry Matthews, Italo Calvino, the Italian, was an honorary member. And these were all writers who loved a generative device. And a generative device it's kind of like a mathematical rule, which you adopt and you have to live within, because it stimulates you to make creative decisions that you wouldn't have made otherwise, get you out of your habits. Georges Perec, probably his most famous example is that he wrote a novel without the letter E anywhere in the book. So not that he used, so he didn't use any word in which the letter E exists in the word. And in French, as in English, that is the most common letter. So he immediately swept half of the French language off his desk, and his patterns, his habits for the way he would normally form a sentence were all screwed up because he couldn't rely on these words that he'd become used to. So this is like that. It's a generative device. You accept this rule on the assumption that it'll help organize the work to some degree, but more importantly, it'll kind of allow you or force you to be inventive, to fulfill the rules that you've laid down. Now, this only is productive if it's invisible to the naked eye, in that if for a generative device to really do its job, it has to kind of disappear, because the novel seems to be told in exactly the right way to the reader. And that's why I say I hope that that you didn't necessarily notice that the book is structured in this way. Now, I think that in this case, one of the reasons I immediately thought this is a good device for this book is because I think it's very true to sort of the longer life experience. And I think it was very fitting to the reader's needs, meaning that when the Count went in the hotel for the first time, and when you went with him in the hotel, I felt like granularity was going to make a lot of sense. He was going to really feel one day at a time. And you're going to want to see the rooms, the people who are there, learn the architecture, kind of understand that granularity. But as he begins to spend his life in the hotel, and as we read on, neither of us are living that life with that granularity. We start to move more quickly through time, and I think of it as my own life as I remember from being 25 in New York, and I remember when I moved to New York, I remember almost everything about that year. I remember who I dated, where we ate dinner, the parties I went to, the bands we went to see, the apartment I lived in. I remember in incredible granularity. And then you fall in love and you get a job, and suddenly it's like you got a job, and 10 years later, it's kind of, well, my career is happening, and then you have kids, and it's like 10 years later, you've been a parent for 10 years. And life kind of does this, you have these moments of intense granularity and moments where it's zipping along. And so, yeah, I felt like that would be a good way to kind of capture the life of the Count in a way that was, it was a mathematical challenge in a way for me in secret, but that was also, more importantly, organically fitting to the story that had to be told.
The novel is being adapted to a miniseries, I believe, with Sir Kenneth Branagh as the Count. Can you tell us anything about how the time scheme will translate into episode structure? Is that a conversation you've been a part of?
Yes, and that's a slow, laborious process, and who knows when they're ever going to finish that, and if they're ever going to finish it. But yes, as planned, that is a mini series, and will have a similar structure to the novel, in that it will be 8-10 hours, with each hour being kind of a focus on a day or two within one of the years, and so it will continue. It will have a similar leaping dynamic.
Neither of us, alas, is in Paris right now, but we're here under the auspices of the American Library in Paris, and Paris plays a very big role in the plot of the novel and in the mind of the Count. So I thought I should ask you about Paris. Why Paris? Why is that the perfect place for the novel, without giving anything away, to visit at the end?
There's an element to which, of course, that the Russian aristocracy in the 19th century was, closer to the Parisian aristocracy than, just about anybody else. It was who they admired, who they befriended, who they copied, and of course, famously, in the 19th century, fine homes and in the aristocracy in Russia, they spoke French instead of Russian. And you open up War and Peace, that's what it begins with. It's people speaking French to each other. And so, so it's quite natural to have the Count's sort of moral and cultural compass kind of pointing towards Paris, certainly, rather than, say, New York City. Good God, which would, you'd think of a terrible place, by comparison. And then, of course, you have another element, because yes, for those of you who have not read, in the final quarter of the book, there are moments where you get a glimpse of Paris. Well, some of that it suits me, because I love Paris. My wife and I have we're there almost every other year. We spend time in Paris, generally based in the Marais, and so for me, that's the nature of a novel. You get to write about what you want to write about, and so I'm a Casablanca fan. That's why Casablanca is in the movie, and I'm a foodie, and that's why food is in the book. That's why Casablanca is in the book. Well, that's why Paris is in the book, because it's a pleasure for me to kind of land there for a moment and write about it, I guess you have also kind of a nice little parallel that, because Casablanca does become an important part of the novel towards the end, of course, the Casablanca, Paris is central to that story. It's the place where they are not, but which is, which everything has begun, and drives all the things that occur in Casablanca, these events in Paris years ago. And so I kind of like that dynamic too, that, the Paris for all of us is sort of this magic place where something happened long ago briefly, yet somehow is still driving and affecting events in our lives today.
Well, I have so many more questions, but I know the audience is also full of questions for you. So maybe we should go to the phones. And I know Catherine's been collecting questions in the chat, so I'll hand it over to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for your wonderful interview. First, a short silent round of applause for your questions. They were just fantastic. And yes, thank you, Amor, also to generously taking audience questions. So I'm going to go right ahead and dive in here. So I had a couple questions along the same line here, and the latest comes from Hillary, who's wondering how the book was received in Russia.
To be honest, I don't have a lot of visibility on that. As an author, you don't get, reports on that or anything like that. The book was translated, has been translated in over 30 languages. And I am very proud of the fact that it was translated into almost all of the Soviet bloc languages, of which there are many, and so there was great interest in the book in Eastern Europe broadly, and in the former Soviet states, and I would say 95% of the feedback that I've gotten from those countries has been very positive. The book obviously, it's not a work of history, and in writing a story set during Stalinist era, I run the risk that Russians could look at the book and say, first of all, he has no business telling this story, and second of all, he's got it wrong, and third, he doesn't pay attention enough to how terrible Stalin was and how bad he was to the Russian people. So you're exposed to that as a novelist, and what I'm glad to say is that for the most part, Eastern Europeans and Russians who picked it up read it in the way that I hoped it would be read, which is that they didn't read it as an investigation, a historical investigation of their times. They did read it with a touch of the fairy tale tied to it. Russia, of course, as a nation, has a great history of the fairy tale, much as the German background does, and so the sort of the idea of and in addition to which, in Russian literature, there's a history of the magical and ironic playing an important role. If you think of Gogol or of Bulgakov, and so and I wanted the novel, I wanted it to signal to the reader that it's not a work of history, partly through elements of humor or magic or that are there, to allow the reader to kind of into this world, which is partly historic and partly imagined, partly an investigation of historical events, but partly have an aspect of the fairy tale to it. And as I say, for the most part, the feedback has been that along those lines. The other thing that's been kind of interesting about it, for those in France, this may be less obvious, but in the United States, for most of my generation was a Cold War generation. I'm 56. And so most of the people who were my parents' generation, in my generation, grew up with a very black and white sense of what life in Russia was, because that's what we were told. We received this kind of image from the 50s onward that everyone in Russia was miserable. Everybody wanted to leave. It's all about breadlines and arrests and spying, and that's what it is. And in a totalitarian hardship. And now, of course, there are aspects of those bad things which were part of Russian life on and off over the course of half a century, to different degrees at different times with different people. But Russian life was also, throughout the Soviet era, was a world where people fell in love. They got married, they had children, they celebrated as families, they had great love of the arts, of plays, of fine music, of food. Even when resources were scarce, they would gather together and cook what they could and celebrate as best they could. And so I think that one of the things that feedback I've gotten is that there's an appreciation of the fact that an American would strive to tell a Russian story which was not simply kind of this black and white version of the Soviet era, but try to do a little bit more justice to what actually, the full complexity, which included a lot of positive things, not politically, but personally, of the lives of people who were there at the time, and the book is trying to balance those things.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm going to try to do a sort of mix of very general and some specific questions for those who have read the book. So moving on to a more specific one. This is from Barbara, who's asking, where did you get the idea for the word game Zoot that the Count plays with his daughter? And I did want to get to this one because, so my American Library in Paris book group read your book and we discussed it last week. And this came up as sort of one of the favorite moments for many, many people. So maybe quickly go into what that game is and where the origins were. Yeah.
If you haven't read or gotten to that part, Zoot is a game that the Count plays with a young woman in his care. And it is very simple. It's very simple rules. You play it at dinner, let's say, and it'll be famous quartets. And so famous foursomes. And if you have four people at a table, you start going around, and you say, okay, well, the Beatles, famous foursome, and then somebody else as well, the Four Seasons, not the band, but the actual seasons, the suits of a deck of cards, hearts, clubs, spades, diamonds. And you keep going around and around until someone cannot come up with a famous foursome and they lose the round, in essence. Now, so where did this come from? This was something that my wife and I invented, not surprisingly, when our children were basically 5 and 8 or something like that, 6 and 9, and we would go out to dinner. And we would order, and then you have this, 20 minutes while you're waiting for the food. And, with children that age, it can be a disaster. They're wandering around the restaurant or, throwing things or, exhausted. So this is the game that we would play once the order was placed as we were waiting. And the great thing about it is that you can play it at any age, because we would play things like animals that can fly, and kids can go on that forever and ever. And by the way, there's many more than you think there are. You know, it's gonna be good for, yeah, it's birds. Okay, sure, birds. But then, and by the way, you can also say animals that are real or imagined. Then you get centaurs and vampires and Superman or whatever, but there are all kinds of things. But never mind the insect world, which they come, tons of them can fly. So anyway, we would play this game, and the kids could play it as well as the adults, and you'd go around and around and around. So that is where that came from. And yes, it was sort of, it's one of those moments of the anarchy in the outline, popping up in the outline. The outline says, Count and Sophia have dinner. But then you're writing the scene, and they're placing their order, and then something like, well, then suddenly the Count is saying, oh, there's a perilous time between ordering and waiting for your food, because that was my own experience. And then they're like, oh my God, they should play Zoot. That should be what they play. And so then it kind of pops up through the narrative, and you're like, oh yeah, that's the right way to do it.
Great. I agree. It was the absolute right way to do it. And I imagine many people have exported that game from the book since. Okay, so moving on to a question about research. I'm getting a couple of questions along these same lines from Hillary and Connie as well. So how much time might you have spent in Russia and studying Russian literature before writing the book? And Hillary was interested in any research you did on daily life in the Stalinist era.
So first of all, I don't pick a topic, research it, and then write a book. What I do is pick a topic that is grounded in something I've had a long-standing fascination in. So Rules of Civility is in New York in 1938. And since I was a kid, I've loved the 30s and the 20s. I watched the movies, I listened to the music, I read the novels, I studied the art movements. So when I sat down to write Rules of Civility, I had 30 years of interest in that era. And I used that to invent the book without doing any research. And then when the first draft was finished, I went and did applied research to sharpen details and correct some things. General in Moscow is very similar. I became interested in Russian culture when I read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment as an 18-year-old, and that began my interest in Russian literature, 40 years ago. But that grew in kind of an interest into the great Russian novelists, led to the avant-garde in Russia before the revolution. And then I got interested in the Soviet era, to various degree. And a lot of that, most of that was reading the novels, as the question implies. But along the way, I did read, some biographies, I read some histories. And this is long, decades before I wrote this book, I read this extraordinary book by Fitzpatrick, who was a Princeton historian, and she writes everyday history as her field. So she's very interested in well, how do people buy bread? How did that happen? What actually was required of that? How far would you have to walk? How long would you have to stay in line? And she would go and look through diaries and various records to kind of recreate what was happening on the ground in an everyday fashion. And so she wrote a book called Everyday Stalinism, which covers all kinds of things: magazine reading, games that were played, comic books, collections that were had, favorite foods, favorite music, in the 30s and the 40s, and sort of looking in the granular reality of the individuals. But then kind of occasionally, she doesn't always have to do it. You usually kind of figure out how it resonates with the bigger picture, but she connects the dots sometimes for you. And so that kind of also filled out some of my picture of Russian life before I sat down to write the book. But once again, as in the case of Rules of Civility, I made the decision I would write the novel without doing any research, other than what I had read in the past. And then I'd kind of, and then I would do some research when I was done. So I don't speak Russian. I'd only been to Russia once in my life when I wrote the book, and I'd been there for about 6 days, I think. I'd never spent the night in the Metropole Hotel. And so when I sat down to write the book, I said, all right, when I'm finished with the first draft, I'll go to Russia and I'll move into the Metropole Hotel for about 10 days, and I'll start revising the book while I'm there and investigating Russian details that I want to have sharper. And so now, why do I do that? Why do I postpone that sort of applied research to after the drafting? And the reason really is because my instinct is that kind of research can really weigh down the imaginative process and get in the way of the story, how it needs to be envisioned and told. And so I want to have as much investment in the invention and in the feelings of the people and the thoughts that they're having in the story before I worry about hard facts. And of course, then you have a balance. Not all of the book is certainly factual. Most famously, the Count is sent on the first day from his suite on the 3rd floor to the attic on the 6th floor, where he spends the rest of his time in the hotel over 30 years. And there is no 6th floor of the Metropole Hotel. And I love that. That suits me just fine. And I've come to I know that the manager of the hotel now quite well. And last time I was there, I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "Oh, it's great. We really love the book, and people come and they want to stay see the hotel." And he said the only problem is that everybody wants to go to the 6th floor. So yeah, that's great. So I don't mind having some blend between the factual and the imaginary. And but for me, yeah, the research is something that I try to do at the end.
Okay, great. And yeah, we actually did have a lot of chatter coming in about the Metropole. So I think you've kind of answered that, but people were sharing that they were even doing tours.
Yes.
About the book. So that's just fascinating.
My proudest on that front.
Yes, please.
Is that in the book, sort of very passing, the Count befriends Richard Vanderweil, the American who's hanging out in the bar of the Metropole, and who's sort of a bon vivant a little bit. And sort of has a devil-may-care attitude, and they're kind of having a nice time and drinking and enjoying themselves. And they challenge the bartender to make a drink in each of the 4 colors of St. Basil's Cathedral. And so the bartender invents, the Christmas tree, which is dark, which is green, and the robin's egg, which is blue, and the brick wall, which is red, and the goldenrod, which is yellow. So he invents these 4 different drinks, 4 different colors. These cocktails, and the stories tells you that it becomes known that if you can drink all 4, that you become like the Archbishop of Russia or whatever, something, some crazy title. And so, but at any rate, they sell those drinks at the bar of the Metropole Hotel. So I encourage you, if you're there, to order, take your pick, order one of them.
Great, thank you. And I think I'll take 2 more questions. Does that sound good to you, Amor? You had offered that you'd, give us a little bit more time for the audience, which is fantastic. So the next one is from Georgiana, who's saying that both Tinker and the Count have excellent manners. How do you see the connection between manners and ethics, or between manners and a life well lived?
You're right about the observation, and I like the way you put the question, because I do. Manners and civility do play a role in both novels in different ways, but I do think that I suppose the reason is because I am kind of fascinated with where manners, which are external to some degree, where do they begin and end versus, say, human or integrity, which is internal. And one of the things I find very interesting is that if you look back at the history of the development of manners and of civil behavior, at the beginning, there was no distinction between the two. The well-mannered person who strove to be well-mannered, basically the gentleman or the knight, if you will, they viewed appropriate behavior at the table and the never telling a lie as one of this, as the same kind of part of the same code. You would always treat the stranger or an elderly person or a woman, if you're a man, with respect, and you would never resort to violence. You wouldn't use filthy language, but on the other hand, you wouldn't lie, you wouldn't steal, you would help someone in need, and so what we think of as kind of more the social manners type things versus the sort of more moral and integrity type things, we've kind of put those into 2 different categories in the modern era. Whereas 4 in the grand tradition of gentlemanly behavior, they really were they were bound together. And so I'm very interested in kind of where those things, how they, for the individual, where they're tied together and where they're not. Where is the outward behavior in harmony with the inward goals? Where is it a deceit? Where is there a person of great virtue with a crass outward behavior because they've never been schooled, let's say, where is the dissonance? And on a graded basis, because there's no on and off switch for these things. There's this incredibly very graded gradation of of behavior that at each step of the way, there's some sort of balance between manners and civility that is at play. And so I do like to investigate. Now, having said all that, the novel that I had handed in today, which will come out next October, is about 3 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy who are on their way from Nebraska to New York City in 1954. And the whole book takes place over 10 days. And there is no civility in it whatsoever. So don't expect it the next time.
It sounds good. Well, thank you for all of the lessons that were in this book in any case. And I do actually have a question about that. Actually, KJ has sent 2 questions that are kind of around a clock theme. So I'm going to go ahead and ask them both. The first is, what was the inspiration for the twice tolling clock?
Yep.
And the second then is, what timeless perspectives on life would you be happy for a reader to take away from A Gentleman in Moscow? That's a lovely question to end on, I think, maybe.
Okay, so we'll start with the clock. I had this notion, if again, it's the difference between the outline and kind of the end product or whatever, the end creation. In the outline, I had the notion, of course, that the Count was going to take certain things with him to his room. He's going to have a handful of things left, after the war, and being stripped of his possessions at the mansion, but then again at the hotel, he's going to have a few left. And so I had this notion of there being a clock that was important to his father, and I it was kind of in the room, and I think I sort of, when I was actually writing the book, I began to investigate what's interesting about the clock. The father, if he loved it and the son wants to keep it, there must have been something special about it. And so I was originally, I think the notion was that, at the hour, it would play a certain kind of music. It would play Beethoven or Mozart, or whatever, and that was going to be the thing. And the importance of Beethoven or Mozart to the father would be woven into the narrative, or would be, the Count would recollect. Maybe it would be such a fantastic clock that it would play a part of one of Beethoven's different symphonies at each hour, a different symphony, whatever. So I was this is what I was, the kind of thought process. And you're like, no, it's not working. I'm not interested in this, or it's cumbersome, or it's not right. And so you start to strip down the idea a little bit. And eventually I was sort of like, what if instead of this really elaborate chiming, what if it went in the other direction? What if the clock rarely chimed? What if it was just, once or twice a day? And I'm like, oh yeah, the twice tolling clock, that's what it is. It's at noon and midnight. And I had this vision of the Count's father already, that he was kind of he was an aristocrat who probably lived in the countryside and tried to run the farm in a modern way, in a serious fashion. He wasn't a dilettante. That was kind of the guy he was. And so suddenly, as soon as the twice tolling clock presented myself, I'm like, that's such a better expression of who the Count's father is, and what his father might mean to him, and how it might come down, because then you start to write it and really investigate it. This notion of, he loves the clock that only tolls twice because he says that you should have a full day of activity by the time noon arrives. So if you haven't if you haven't done a full day's work by the time that the clock chimes noon, you're a lazy person, as opposed to the person who wakes up when the clock chimes noon. And I think the father says, you should never even hear the second chime, because you should be in bed by 8 o'clock or 9 or 10 o'clock, so that you can get up at 5 in the morning. And anybody who's hearing the midnight chime, it's a sign that their life is kind of has gone astray. Which of course the Count was definitely a midnight chime guy, not a noon guy. So suddenly, as I say, you this moment of maybe it chimes twice a day, the ramifications of that start to present themselves really quickly. If I know my characters well enough, I know the setting well enough, I know the themes well enough, all you have to do is sort of say twice tolling clock, and I'm like, okay, I can see how this plays out. And so that's the story of that. But to the other question, and I mean this sincerely, is about what would I get you to take away or remember? And the truth is, and then this is totally true, when I travel around the country or to speak about my work, or by the way, if you have a question and it was not answered today, you just go to amortowles.com, you go to the contact page, and if you send an email through the contact page, it goes right to me. So and you can send me your question. But the point is that yeah, in the modern era, people reach me every day. They'll say they have a question or a comment, or they want to share an observation or whatever, but so when I've traveled the country to talk about the book, or when I receive emails, if somebody pinpoints a sentence or a passage that was particularly meaningful to them, they say, this, I wrote this down, or I sent this to my daughter, I read it out loud to my wife, or I put it on a post-it on my computer screen, whatever the version. 99% of the time, the thing which they're talking about, the sentence, the paragraph, this meaningful, moving, insightful paragraph, whatever, is something that I never would have come up with in the course of my daily life. It's not something that I would suddenly observe as I was walking down the street. It's not something I would tell my children. It's not something I would say to a friend over dinner. It is something which has come out of the writing process. Because in the writing process, you're creating a person who you are not. In this case, the Count, who's got a background that I don't have. And I'm putting him in a situation that I've never been in. And he has a personality that I don't have. And you take this mix, his personality, his background, you put it in a situation that I've never been in, and he is the one who, or Katie in the case of Rules of Civility in New York, is looking around and literally while I'm writing, I know the scene or whatever, but suddenly the Count or Katie will stop and look around and say, the thing about it is, and then it just comes rattling off. And usually I'm like, I get the end, I hit the period, and I'm like, well done, Count. That is so true. What an interesting thing to say. And that's the way those kinds of things present themselves. It's not me saying it's time to say something important in the book, and here's an important thing I've got to say. It's almost always comes as a surprise to me. So I don't have one for you. I don't, I would trust what the Count says more than you should trust what I say. So yeah, if you want something to remember, go back to the thing that you underlined in the book that the Count said, and that's probably of more value to you than anything I could tell you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, that's about all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
Your generosity in being here with us virtually, Amor, and also, of course, to Mark Mayer for conducting the wonderful interview.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Yeah, I've been sneakily taking notes while interviewing. So I thank you for all these insights and of course for your wonderful work. It's been a joy talking to you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Paris, for joining.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just close with a couple of comments as well. Also, I wanted to thank our audience, of course, for your questions and comments throughout the program. I wanted to let everybody know that the American Library in Paris is a nonprofit, and we do welcome donations. So in person, we generally, welcome donations of about 10 euros per event or per person. If you're interested in supporting the library, you can go ahead and take a look at that email that I sent out that included the Zoom link. And just above that, there's a link to donate. So if that's something you might want to do, I invite you to click on that link. And otherwise, we hope to see you at another program again very soon. Everything is posted for the months of January and February, so you can go ahead and take a look and see if anything grabs your interest, and just go ahead and sign up in the same way that you were able to register for this event. And also, before we sign off here, Audrey had mentioned that we have our book award coming up on the 14th of January, and there's a link to sign up for that. You can find that on our homepage as well. But if you wanted to grab that before we close out, I just recommend scrolling up in the chat because you're about to lose it when I say goodbye here. So thank you again, Mark, Amor, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everybody. Good night.